Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Institute of Science and Technology Austria, short ISTA. My name is Florian Schlederer. I'm part of the Communications and Events Division, and it's my honor to guide you through today's 51st ISTA Lecture. So maybe in the beginning a few words about the Institute, since we have guests who are not part of it. The Institute of Science and Technology Austria, ISTA, was founded roughly 15 years ago as a public research institution with graduate education. It was always dedicated to cutting-edge research, had an international outset and top facilities, but also it was dedicated to really attract the uniquely curious. So the best researchers in the world should come here to this site and do research. And looking at this audience, I see many faces who work here and research here, do their PhD here, and I think I can confidently say it has worked. We have attracted the uniquely curious. The ISTA Lecture series was about fostering exchange, and when I say exchange, I don't only mean between scientists. I mean also between science and the Austrian public, since the ISTA Lecture series is a public lecture series. And therefore, I especially welcome the people who made the journey to this institute today. We are really glad to have you here tonight. The ISTA Lecture series also brings exceptional researchers of global renown to Austria and to this institute. And the track record speaks for itself. Of the 50 speakers, more than half were Nobel Prize, Fields Medal, or Turing Award winners. And also today's guest is an esteemed pioneer in his area of research. But before we dive into biodiversity and the talk, let me also allow Martin Hetzer, the president of the Institute, a few introductory remarks.
Okay, also from my side, welcome everybody. Good evening to the 51st ISTA Lecture. It's good to see so many of you. Today, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP28, ended. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, opened the conference with the words, "We are living through climate collapse in real time." Now, climate change, as I think we all know, is one of the greatest challenges of our time. I think we all have been directly affected by it already. Another less debated but very important aspect is the massive modification across the biosphere, or in today's speaker's words, the global reshuffling of species. Now, we live in a time in our planet's history where the influence of one species, Homo sapiens, stands unparalleled. This era is often referred to as the Anthropocene. Alexander von Humboldt was actually one of the first. We talked briefly about researchers who understood the human impact on the changes in the biosphere. And we have a talk about this next year about Alexander Humboldt's life, so please look out for that. So for the first time, we found ourselves as a dominant force shaping the natural world at an unprecedented level, and as you will hear, also as an unprecedented speed and rate. This newfound status comes with profound implications as we witness the redistribution of different species on a global scale, a phenomenon which has far-reaching consequences for both biodiversity and human livelihoods. And research in that area is absolutely critical. The Anthropocene marks a pivotal moment where the actions of humanity drive the trajectory of countless species, some facing decline and extinction, while others traverse the globe, altering the very essence of global biogeography. The introduction of new species into new regions is called biological invasions. We'll hear about that. And that has emerged as a defining signature of this era of the Anthropocene, underscoring our role as architects of the Earth's ecological narrative. So these developments, as daunting as they are, they also raise numerous research questions related to global patterns and drivers of biological diversity. So one scientist who pioneered work on those questions and in this area is our esteemed speaker today. Franz Essl's research on invasive species and biogeography spans over more than 2.5 decades. In these years, he authored more than 300 scientific articles and is repeatedly listed as one of the world's most highly cited researchers in the field environment and ecology. He's professor at the University of Vienna, and he heads the division of bioinvasions, global change, and macroecology at the Department of Botany and Biodiversity Research. He's a member of numerous international scientific initiatives and boards, such as the European Working Group on Biological Invasions, where he acts as vice president, or has been for almost 10 years now. For his outstanding scientific contributions, he was recognized Austrian Scientist of the Year 2022 by the Science Journalism Club. So congratulations to that as well. So it's my pleasure to welcome Franz Essl to the stage and give a lecture about the global reshuffling of species. Sorry, it's late already, but probably we need a glass of red wine, so I hope you do better. Okay, welcome, Franz.
Danke. Yeah, thanks a lot for the very nice introduction. And before I start with my talk, I would like to disappoint you. If you're expecting the winter bash, which will take place tomorrow, the big party, it's tomorrow, it's not today. If you are not expecting that, please stay. And I would like to take you with me on a journey. And it's a journey on the ecology in the Anthropocene, in a world that's, as Martin has already pointed out, is changing as rapidly as it has not been doing since the impact that killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And of course, it will be a mixture, and the audience is also quite varied. Also, the background interest you represent is probably quite broad. I will combine scientific results from our research, from colleagues' research, and also I would like to weave it in a general story, how I perceive these changes are playing out and what are the underlying factors. So, the world of yesterday, literally speaking, dominated by ecosystems and landscapes that you can see in these pictures. Extensively used or pristine landscapes, which we ecologists have in our minds when we think about our profession. This world is becoming history. And Martin has pointed it out, it's due to the action of one species, one of several million species. It's Homo sapiens, our species. And you can see here on the left side a graph. You don't have to read it, that's not the point here. But what you can easily see, these are all indicators how the human footprint has changed over time in the recent decades. And what you can basically see is a steep increase in all trajectories, in urban population, in paper consumptions, in McDonald's restaurants, basically in everything. Of course, McDonald's restaurants maybe per se have not a lot to do with biodiversity, but they are an indicator of how we humans expand our global footprint, and that's already reflected also in the Anthropocene. In the term Anthropocene, the first era dominated by one species, and the era is named after this species, after us, humans. One way to highlight that human dominance in a very nice and intriguing way is this graph. At first glance, you only see gray dots, but these gray dots represent something. In the center, in dark gray, you see the weight of humanity. This graph shows you the weight of large land mammals with a living weight of more than 50 kilograms. That's the weight of humanity in the center. There's a second category surrounding us, like the global 1 billion cattle, sheep, and so on, our domestic animals. But there's a third category, maybe you have not even seen it. The green dots at the very periphery here, this is the combined weight of all wild living mammals, large ones. Like here, the total weight of the elephant population on Earth. It's one green spot here. And combined, the weight of humanity and of our domestic animals comes up to 95% of the total weight of large living land mammals. All wild mammals are just 5%. Giraffes, elephants, tigers, lions, and so on and so on. And that shows you that we are really the driving force on Earth. Yeah, I understand that. But there's another phenomenon, and that's particularly relevant if you think about biological innovations. Not only have we shaped and transformed the ecology of the Earth, we also have shaped the distances. We have reduced the distances, not physically, but we have broken up dispersal barriers. What was separated has become connected. If you look on a map, you don't see it, but if you plot global transport networks over time, then you see it. Here you see the evolution of the global transport network represented by ship lanes. In 1500, very few ship lanes, and basically centered to the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts of Europe, have been regularly trafficked and used by humans. A few hundred years later, already a first, but still sparse network of ship lanes connecting basically every continent at least, has been established. But that's still nothing compared to the current situation where ship lanes are connecting every dot on every continent, on the coast. And of course, it's overlaid by other networks that transport goods, but also species across large distances, like airplanes. That's also a profound change in the ecology and biogeography of our planet. Not visible on a physical map, but still it's here and it has implications. It's one of the underlying drivers of what we call, as Martin has said already, biological invasions. So we are speaking about aliens, alien species. That's the English term of species that have been moved by humans to other places where they were not able to spread by themselves. We are of course not talking about these alien species, but for instance about these alien species. So that's a very personal picture. I have taken it a year ago in Vienna. I'm not sure if anyone has an idea what you can see here. Obviously it's a mammal, obviously it's dead, because one of our cats has caught it and killed it, and we found it in the morning and the next day, and we had no idea what it is. Yeah? Yeah. Why do you know that? Do you miss one? That's right. It's a sugar glider, and Flugbeutler. Yeah? Which is, of course, not native in Vienna, not native in Europe, not even native on the Northern Hemisphere. It's native to, well, maybe it's the Northern Hemisphere, but in the tropics, Papua New Guinea. It's sometimes held in captivity by people who like these animals, obviously. And this individual had the bad luck to escape and to meet our cats, and they caught it. So, of course, it would never have been able to establish in Vienna. But you see how exotic species are kept basically everywhere. And some of them, at some point in time, also escape. And some of them, in some point in time, if climate and other features of the environment are suitable, are able to establish, to become a part of the new environment. And even if this species is not occurring in the wild in Austria, many other alien species we have in Austria. These are pictures, it's a random assortation of pictures that show you the wide variety of alien species you can find in Austria. Black locust, golden roads, slider turtle, and other animals from basically all taxonomic groups. But still, the ones you recognize, and they're shown here, there's just the tip of an iceberg that is growing rapidly. So I would like to introduce now for you, and also present you some insights on the new ecology in the Anthropocene in terms of species redistributions. So, and some questions and insights I would like to share with you is, how many alien species do we have on Earth? What are the hotspots, or where are the hotspots? What is the temporal dynamics, not only the spatial picture, but also the temporal dynamics of species accumulation? What are the underlying drivers? What is causing the increase in the spread of alien species? And ultimately, what are the consequences? The consequences for biogeography, for society, and for nature conservation, for biodiversity. And finally, I also will touch upon how are the interactions between alien species spread and other drivers of global environmental change. Because there are also synergetic interactions. And what will the future bring? That's a question of eminent interest in basically all fields of environmental sciences and also for invasive species or alien species. So this will be more or less a journey you will have. I would like to invite you for the next half an hour before we start our discussions. I start with this one. The first global synthesis on plant invasions, the GIoNAF initiative. That was an initiative that started 15 years ago. As you can see here, I looked much younger. That's me. With other colleagues, we established a team where we tried to compile the first global database, scratching all data together, where alien species lists and so on, the numbers of alien species in regions, on islands, and in countries across the globe, to have the first overview on the distribution of alien plant species, which was not available at this time. Some of the key insights I would like to share with you. This is a hotspot map of alien plant species distributions. You see that the globe looks a bit weird. The more alien species, plant species, are occurring in a region, the bigger the respective region is being displayed here, and also the more the color is fading into red. And you can see there are some big blobs, especially in North America, parts of Western and Central Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other regions are really strongly showing up. I will come back to this. There are also issues with data availability, but what you can basically see is about 13,000 species, plant species, just to give you an idea how much species these are. That's the total native flora, all native plant species in Europe. That's also about 13,000 species between the North Cape and Sicily. As many species are now also alien species on the globe. That's about 4% of all existing plant species are established, naturalized, at least in one region. But there's another way you can look at this picture, that's shown here. It shows you now the contribution, the proportion of alien plant species relative to the native flora, the native species pool. And the higher the proportion, the bigger the red dots. And you can see now many red dots in the oceans, which you did not see before, because these are islands. You don't see them on a global map, basically, and many are small islands. But this picture also reveals something. 26%, so basically every fourth island, has now more alien species in its flora than native species. That's basically a total, shift in the contribution or composition of the flora on islands within just very few hundred years, because many of these islands have only been colonized by Europeans, at least in the last at maximum 3 centuries. Another point, if you look on the most widely spread alien species, these are the top 5 species. You can see that some species already colonize roughly half of the globe, at least of the regions of the globe. And if you're a botanist, you will recognize quite some of these species because many of them are European species, like Sonchus oleratius, the winner here. That's a species, a ruderal species, you will for sure find here on the campus of ISTA. 100% sure. Gänsedistel. So if you have chicken, They like it very much. Okay, that was a bit about plants on this global scale. Now I would like to shift your attention to animals. What about other taxonomic groups? So we also teamed up with other groups, and we wanted to make a global cross-taxonomic assessment built on a number of 8 taxonomic groups: mammals, birds, amphibians, freshwater fish, reptiles, ants, spiders, and vascular plants. So we also compiled for these additional 7 taxonomic groups a similar database as I've shown to you before. And what you can see, like for mammals, you have different distribution patterns, different hotspots, as you can see here. Or for birds, where the hotspot is basically one island group, Hawaii, with 91 naturalized introduced alien bird species. Or for ants, which are rather thermophilic, so most of the regions where alien ants are occurring, and some of them have really big impact there, are in the tropics and subtropics. But the pictures are different for different taxonomic groups. So we were interested, what's the global hotspots you get if you combine all taxonomic groups together? And what you can see here is an quantile analysis showing you the top 2.5% of most invaded regions across all 8 taxonomic groups. And you can see, some hotspots are like in North America, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Not too surprising. Many of these regions were known already that they are quite prone to biological invasions. But you may ask, okay, the regions are very different in size. The research effort is also quite different. So maybe it's also partly an artifact. So what we also did, okay, when we account for the difference in size, and also for the difference in research intensity, so we use the distribution of GBIF data, that's a global data repository of species distributions with hundreds of millions of entries. You can calculate research effort per region and also account for the difference in size between regions, and then you can redo the analysis, also accounting for other factors. But the important story is, if you do that, you also see that the hotspots are shifting away from the continents into the oceans, into tropical and subtropical regions, in the oceans into islands. You don't see this if you do not account for that, because islands are not by definition, but in reality mostly relatively small. So they have a lower number of species, but relatively they are the most invaded regions globally. Still, islands differ among each other as well, so we also looked into a factor that's maybe highly relevant for invasion levels on islands. So we selected islands in the tropics and subtropics, 257 islands, and focused on 5 taxonomic groups that are best documented, because we were interested if island isolation affects the level of invasion. And what we found, also accounting for many other factors, but I don't show this additional analysis here, I just focus on some results, is if you order the islands along the distance to the next continents, that's the distance in kilometers to the next continents, you get specific pictures for alien species, for native species richness, and for native and alien species richness combined. So for alien species, there's a consistent increase in the number of alien species across taxonomic groups with increasing distance. For native species, it's the other way around. The further away from the next continent, so the more isolated an island is, the fewer native species are there, because of, most likely, colonization difficulties. If you have a long distance to travel across the oceans, it's hard to get there, so there's a lower level of native species on these islands. If you combine both, they roughly level each other out. Obviously, you're shifting the community richness by filling up empty niches from more distant islands towards a carrying capacity that the islands can support in the end. But main message of this analysis is more isolated islands are more vulnerable to invasions because there is more unused niche space, obviously. But these islands, even if they have few native species, are the ones, they have a very distinct fauna and flora. Many of the species occurring on isolated islands are unique. They only occur on these isolated islands. Just think about Galapagos. So, but exactly these islands are most invaded nowadays, and that's really a huge threat to the future of this native island fauna and floras. In another analysis focusing on gastropods, on snails, as you can see here, for instance, we compiled for a subset of regions, just 50 regions on the globe. You see the distribution here. The alien and native gastropod fauna. And as you can imagine, gastropods, snails are poor dispersers. Because they are notoriously slow. And what we did were two kinds of analysis. We first looked into the similarity between these different gastropod faunas when only considering the native ranges of these species. And then you see that the regions are ordered by similarity and clustered by similarity into different clusters, which are shown in different colors here. And these clusters are now here shown on the map here. And if you're a biogeographer, you're not very surprised. What you see the biogeographic realms, like the Nearctic and Holarctic, or the Holarctic here in the north, the Neotropics and other regions here that are roughly similar in the composition of their gastropod fauna. That's basically confirming biogeography. That's not the surprising part here. But if you do the same analysis and now also account for the alien occurrences of the same species, where they have been introduced and are now occurring in the wild, do the same kind of similarity analysis in composition, you see a very different picture. You just get two big clusters, a green and a red one. And if you map these clusters on the globe, you also see a very different picture. These are basically latitudinal clusters. Like the red one is a temperate cluster with cold winters on the northern and the southern hemisphere. So the distance does not matter anymore, basically, because the fauna of this taxonomic group becomes very similar to regions that are very, very far away, like New Zealand, from Austria, because this distance does not play a major role anymore. Because the distance is now nearly irrelevant, because humans are transporting these species across the globe. And you can also see this here if you do a distance analysis of similarity. Before human dispersal, you had a strong signal of distance decay in similarity. That indicates that distance is a filter for species dispersal. If you do the same analysis with the data set including the alien occurrences, you see there's still a bit of a signal, but it's rather weak, much weaker than it was before. And that's why I call it, the new Pangaea, because this distance decay is at least eroding to a quite substantial degree. From space to time. What we also did, we compiled another database on the first records. What is a first record? A first record is when an alien species is observed, recorded for the first time in a region, like in Austria. Let's say Robinie, black locust, the tree I have shown in one of the pictures, was first observed in the wild in Austria, let's say in 1850. Then this is the first record for Austria. Maybe it was found for the first time in 1880 in Germany. Then 1880 is the first record for Germany. So we did this for many taxonomic groups and compiled this global database of alien species first records, which contains more than 50,000 entries, first records in the region, for about 15,000 species, alien species. The first analysis was, do we see any signs of a saturation of species, alien species accumulation? At some point in time, even if the drivers are increasing in intensity, like trade is increasing, that's no question at all, at some point in time we will reach a kind of a plateau. Because only a subset of species will be able to establish in other regions. Many species are very specialized to their environment. They probably will never naturalize somewhere else. So at some point in time, you are exhausting the species pool, the candidate species pool of potential alien species. Even if the drivers are increasing, there are no more candidate species left. So this was the question we asked here. What you can see here is above for the full data set, but here for different taxonomic groups, the number of alien species first records, starting from 1800 to 2000, shown with by individual points, and then there's a smooth line that shows you the trend, basically, in red. So what you see quite easily is there's a strong increase in most taxonomic groups of these first records, which means many of the alien species we have on the globe are relatively recent introductions or at least observations. There are a few exceptions, like there's a plateau for vascular plants during the last 100 years, but on a high level. And two taxonomic groups are actually declining, mammals and fish, and that's also indicating differences in societal and political or legislative norms. 100 years ago, it was very easy to release mammals or fish species in countries like Australia or New Zealand. You just had to do it. Nowadays, that's completely forbidden and also not possible to do anymore. And this is reflected in this decline of new introductions. But still, for other taxonomic groups, you see a strong increase. So there are very few signs of a saturation. And for most taxonomic groups, there's no sign at all of saturation. In a related additional analysis, we looked into emerging aliens. So what is an emerging alien? It's an alien species that is recorded for the first time as an alien. So there's no alien record before, but at some point in time it occurs as an alien in a country for the first time. So species that become new additions to the alien fauna and flora on the globe. Also not going into the details of this analysis, you also see it's a temporal analysis, but the basic points here are, maybe I just show the results. 1/4 of current records of an alien species newly recorded in a region, it's such an emerging alien, in addition to the alien fauna and flora. So there are still quite a number of candidate species, obviously, that have the potential to become alien. So the species pool is not yet exhausted. And importantly, this trend can only be explained in the models if you increase the source pool of candidate species. So it's maybe a bit irritating because you cannot increase the source pool is the same basically. You maybe think you have a global fauna and flora, and the number is fixed. At most, it's declining slowly because there are species extinctions, but it's not increasing. But technically, it's increasing. Many regions and also the fauna and flora were not part of the global trade network. So they were not accessible to be picked up and integrated into the global exchange of species. The expansion of trade and transport has technically expanded the accessible species pool into regions where it were previously not accessible, and this expands still the source pool for potential new aliens. That's a key insight here. And maybe one of the few studies where we worked actually on small scales compared to these large scales. I mean, the coverage is still global, but many biodiversity studies also focus on plot data, so local scale studies. Biodiversity composition and richness on a meadow, which you can document with such a plot, as you can see on the right panel here. And we used such a data set to analyze, okay, now we have this increase in global species numbers of alien species, without any doubt. What's about the local scale? How is it playing out on this scale? Because you may argue, and this was also something we found, that you have two gradients. One is a gradient of increasing numbers of alien species with land use intensity. Here you have primary, that means primary vegetation, just in short. And here you have most intensively used and also modified landscapes like urban habitats. And you see the numbers and the proportions of alien species are increasing across this gradient. The stronger disturbed the habitat, the more aliens you get. But in addition, you also see, if you look on this data, that the proportion of alien species in these local communities is surprisingly small in most cases. And in my understanding, I would argue that's mostly a sign of a temporal lag, of a colonization lag. Even if a species has been introduced, like a plant species, for instance, 100 years ago in Austria, it still has by far, in most cases, not colonized all suitable habitat patches. It may ultimately colonize, because it takes time to spread, to colonize, to reproduce, to spread to the next habitat patch. And this phenomenon you see most likely here. On the local scale, we still have a situation that's far away from an equilibrium situation under current environmental conditions, and not speaking about the changes we are actually causing in the environment. So in essence, what you see is not what you get in the long run, and there are historic legacies that are playing out, and I would also introduce or highlight two of these historic legacies more in detail now. The first one is, as I've shown before already, many species are recent, alien species are relatively recent additions to the regions where they are now introduced. Like 40 to 80% of all alien species in Europe have only been introduced after World War II. That's partly reflecting this rapidly changing global environment that I also have shown you, but you may also argue, okay, if you have this rapidly changing environment, maybe historic conditions are still reflected in the current numbers of alien species. That's what ecologists call invasion depth. You don't see the phenomena in equilibrium with the current situation, but with the historic situation of the underlying drivers. So we tested this using 22 European countries, that's a typo, from 10 taxonomic groups. The species numbers for each of this country. And then we used three really crude indicators for historic situation, 1900, and for the year 2000. Population density, per capita GDP, so basically an indicator of wealth, of economic activity, and the associated human disturbances of the environment. And trade intensity as a measure for introduction effort, for propagule pressure. On the country level, so really crude measures. And we made a comparison between the model explaining the current numbers of alien species in each of these countries. And then we made a model comparison to evaluate which of the model explains better what we see nowadays. And the interesting fact is both models explain some variation. That's what you hope or expect. But the interesting part is the historic model with population density in the year 1900, with per capita GDP in the year 1900, and also with trade intensity in the year 1900, explains highly, significantly better what you observe nowadays. It's still a legacy effect. Over 100 years, despite the strong changes in all these drivers that have occurred from the year 1900 to now. That's really surprising. We did not expect to find such a signal, to be honest, before. And then we thought, okay, if you have these legacy effects, maybe you also have legacy effects if you look into European colonialism. So what we did, we compiled basically also a database from different sources that shows you the evolution of the 4 European empires over time. You see here the British Empire, Portuguese Empire, Spanish Empire, and the Netherlands over time, and you see as time proceeds, empires are expanding, and at some point in time they are shrinking. Yeah? With decolonization, the first empire to basically collapse was the Spanish Empire. You also see that the British Empire started as a latecomer, more or less. Yeah, it really only took off in the relatively late. But then was the biggest one about in the year 1900 or so, where the Spanish Empire was already more or less deceased. So this database basically allowed us to construct or reconstruct. No, one time is enough. To reconstruct if colonial legacies play out in the composition of the alien floras nowadays. So, very shortly, we used the current alien plant distribution that allowed us to assess the composition of the alien floras in each of these, in each region, in each country of the world. Then we also accounted for a number of drivers and environmental factors that are relevant to explain plant and alien plant species distributions in particular. And then we used the colonial history of each region, if it was part of an empire and for how long it was part of an empire, a region, to explain the composition of the alien flora in a country. Basic idea was, if a country, or if 2 countries were part of the same empire, they should have a more similar flora, alien flora, because they also shared trade connections, so similar species were exchanged among those regions, and this should maybe still be visible in the current composition of the alien flora. So we compared it with a null model of a random empire of same size and extent, and then we analyzed if we find such a signal in mean floristic similarity. Basic result was, first, in fact, there's still a signal, a significant signal that regions that were part of the same empire, for instance of the British Empire, have a more similar alien flora compared to regions that have not been part of the same empire. Quite surprising again, because these empires have, well, decolonization happened several decades ago at least, and there were many, many other factors in the meantime that actually played out very strongly, but still the signal is clearly visible. And floristic similarity in these regions increases the longer the occupation time was, the longer a region was part of an empire. That's also relevant. Yeah, quite surprising. Also quite surprising slide you see here. It's just indicating a break, because I would like also to show you some of the consequences, and also, I said, a short look into the future, and that's also a bit of training for the eye muscles. So why should we care about biological invasions, apart from being maybe scientists who are worried about the changes in biogeography and so? Well, there are a number of reasons, and I would like to highlight a few ones only. That's the distribution of our well-known European squirrel in the British Isles. Black is where it currently occurs. And you see it does not occur everywhere anymore, because in the British Isles you have a second squirrel species, grey squirrel, that's native to the eastern US, which is outcompeting the native red squirrel. As you can easily see, because if you combine both maps, all of Great Britain is black, but where the grey squirrel is occurring, the native is not occurring anymore. It's very visible if you look on this island here. That's the only place in southern England where you don't have grey squirrels. It's the only place where you still have red squirrels. In the long run, grey squirrels will replace red squirrels. Yeah, that's just, of course, one example, but it's an example of a cute species. But I would also highlight that the dimension is much bigger, and as you can see, I'm more or less focusing on island situations. Yeah, Paradise Lost. That's the South Pacific between Australia and Southern Asia, and on the right-hand side, there's a bit of South and Central America, and there are thousands of islands and atolls in between. Very nice ones, as you can see. But it's still a paradise lost, and what do I mean by that? 10 years ago, so there was a study that evaluated what happened after the human expansions, the first colonization of all these islands that started a few thousand years ago, starting from Southeastern Asia, going all the way east to, in the end, to New Zealand and Hawaii. So the Austronesian expansion. That was not documented by biologists what happened, but there are middens that allow you to excavate the bones of what humans actually hunted, and that also allows you to reconstruct the historic bird fauna on these different islands, at least for some islands, and then you can do an analysis to scale up to all islands where you don't have this data. The basic finding is, most likely, there's an uncertainty range, but still most likely, nearly 1,000 bird species got extinct as a result of the human colonization of these islands groups. That's incredible. Yeah. That's about 10% of all currently existing bird species on the globe that got extinct and was basically unknown before this analysis was done. It was, of course, known like that moas were gone after Maoris colonized New Zealand, and a few other well-documented iconic species were also known that they were gone, but not the sheer scale of species loss. And the important point here is it was a combination most likely of 3 factors: overhunting for human consumption, of course habitat destruction in the wake of colonization, but thirdly, and as you can also see here by the cartoon of Larsen on the dodo, the third factor were alien species, like rats. Polynesian rats co-colonized basically with the humans all the islands. And many of the flightless or tame, basically there were no mammal predators on these islands. So many of the bird species, but also other species, they also were basically totally tame and easy prey for the rats. Maybe the rats did not eat or attack the big dodos, the adult ones, but they for sure attacked and ate the eggs. So many of the extinctions were co-driven by the introduction of alien species. Yeah, that's for sure. And that's also well established in more recent extinctions. I mean, you for sure know that we are heading towards the 6th extinction crisis globally. And in 60%, that's from a recent summer synthesis report by the World Biodiversity Council, IPBES, in 60% of documented extinctions on the globe, alien species played a role. Sometimes there was the only factor, sometimes there were one factor of a combination of factors, but still it's clear they are a major driver of species loss, especially on islands or isolated systems, ecosystems. It's also clear that economic costs, the impacts on agriculture, on forestry, and human health are increasing rapidly. Yeah, they are currently quadrupling every decade, more or less, and there are also quite some other impacts on the good quality of life. On the economic impacts, also a study we did for analyzing the temporal trajectories, you can see 2 lines here, and both are increasing, and especially the red line here, these are damage costs. So the impacts, the costs that occur when alien species lead to loss in agriculture, or to the dieback of forests because of forest pests. They are increasing, because it's on a logarithmic scale here. Yeah? They are increasing very, very rapidly over time. And currently, the costs, if you compare the costs, the documented costs of biological invasions with the costs of environmental disasters like storms, earthquakes, and floods, you can see that biological invasions actually are on second place after storms, including hurricanes and things like that, but still in advance of earthquakes. So it's really a large amount. And maybe it's also quite surprising because we also didn't think that they are basically on the same scale like the biggest environmental disasters. But the difference is, if you have a big earthquake, yeah, which is a rare event, of course, you have a huge impact. If you have damage caused by alien species, this is much more chronic. You have losses maybe in wheat yield, you have maybe forest dieback, you have health issues like caused by ragweed and things like that, but it's much more chronic, but it's also permanently present. So it's not so inside of society, but if you sum it up, you see the scale and the impacts of alien species on human livelihoods. Yeah, to close, basically a few slides that give you a short outlook into the future, and for sure this outlook will be wrong, like any outlook into the future, but maybe it has some elements that are not totally wrong. We can come back and meet here in 30 years and can reassess that. First, looking into the future accumulation of alien species under a business as usual scenario, based on the historic trajectories for different taxonomic groups, we see that by the year 2050, we can expect an increase by more or less 36% of alien species numbers on different continents and for different taxonomic groups. So that's not too surprising, seeing the rapid increase in recent history, but it's also most likely that this recent increase will also play out in the future, at least under business as usual scenario. There are opportunities to change a business as usual scenario to a more favorable and to a more benign scenario in the end. So we also have worked on these policy relevant aspects for proposing activities on the policy side for managing basically three elements that are necessary to manage much better than they are done nowadays. The introduction pathways, then to identify priority sites for management, especially islands and other vulnerable ecosystems, and also to focus on a subset of species because the impacts are only caused by a small amount of alien species. Many are also rare, are not causing any harm at all. That's also important to note here. To focus on the really relevant species, yeah, with the perspective for 2030 and 2050. So that's basically what we did here. Because it's too much text, I also don't want to guide you through that, but I also want to highlight it's possible to manage in a number of contexts efficiently alien species, particularly on islands. As I already implicated, rats are really a major issue on many islands for native fauna and flora. In the last decades, there have been around 1,000 eradication campaigns being carried out across many islands on the globe, as you can see here. And the vast majority was successful in the sense that the islands became rat-free. Yeah, they were really eradicated. And what's also interesting and should also be highlighted here is the experience also allowed to develop management measures and to tailor them much more efficiently to the local context. Like a few decades ago, the islands that were managed were very small, some hectares in the 1960s or 1970s. More recently, much bigger islands, because it's also like a logarithmic scale here, are now successfully managed. So there is a learning process, how you can efficiently manage big islands. You have a combination of different measures and you can really learn to do it efficiently. Another case study is this very nice beetle, Asian longhorn beetle. If there wouldn't have been a management in Austria, because it was introduced 20 years ago to Austria, it's native to China, you would know the species for sure, because it would have become a major forest pest. It detects a wide range of broad-leaved forest trees. It's a major issue in the US. If you have been to the northeastern US, maybe you know this species because it's causing quite some damage there. So the Austrian agencies were really alert when it was spotted for the first time in Upper Austria in 2001, because people in the village, by coincidence it was Braunau, so yeah, if you're aware of the Austrian history, it's a very special place. These conspicuous galleries of larvae were spotted by people living in the area. And soon it was clear, okay, that's this kind of beetle who is attacking these trees. And there was a rapid response, basically. And this response also involved very smart techniques that were developed. For instance, sniffer dogs were trained on this beetle. So currently, there are 4 sniffer dogs working in Austria, mostly on inspections of imported goods, that can identify larvae or adults of this species. So just this one specific beetle species in goods that contain wood material. So it's really extremely efficient, and many other countries have adopted this strategy. So at border controls, I think most European countries or Central European countries now also employ these sniffer dogs, just trained to detect this one species. Also in something a development that would not have been expected if you would have thought about how you would like to manage an insect species that are notoriously hard to manage, of course. Very shortly, there are also now regulations in place that have made quite an impact. On the European level, there is a European regulation on invasive alien species. On the European Union level, since 2015, in force, with quite a number of obligations and focusing on the harmful species. And other countries that are particularly strongly affected by biological invasions, by the impacts of alien species, like New Zealand, they have adopted a visionary approach, the predator-free in 2050 approach. They are aiming to become predator-free, that means free of introduced alien mammal species that are really playing a big role in the conservation of the native flora and fauna, like many bird species in New Zealand, like the iconic kiwis, by 2050. That's a very ambitious goal. Not sure if it's possible to fully achieve it, but it shows, okay, you have to be ambitious and also a bit visionary, and then you have to implement these visions. When you see take-home messages, you always can rightly guess that's the last slide. So my basic take-home messages are, it was of course just an eclectic selection of scientific progress on the knowledge, understanding of biological invasions, but there was really lots of progress in the recent decade. I also showed that it's really a very dynamically developing phenomenon, like many other changes in what we are causing in the biosphere. That's also an element that's basically increasing in velocity and severity, unfortunately. And the impacts, even if they're often quite hidden, but if you really compile the evidence, you see that the impacts are major and rapidly increasing. Elements and also the scientific understanding is sufficient to guide policies, and goals and thresholds have already been identified and formulated and also taken on board on global major political documents. And there are also best practice examples, and I have shown a very few ones here that highlight that it's not like, okay, you cannot do anything. There are situations where you cannot do anything. If species are widespread, it's really too late in most cases. But you can tailor policies to make the most of limited resources and the most of avoided future impacts. And some of the examples I've shown here. Yeah, needless to say, what I've shown here was a very collaborative work with many, many people. That's basically my group here. And also funded by many other, by many funding agencies and institutions, luckily. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'm prepared and hope for an intensive discussion.